Today we'll finish or do a quick little overview of chapter 8, which is language change, variation, and change. And last time we talked explicitly and extensively about the connections between variation and variation then leading potentially to change. Without variation, there wouldn't be change, but some people just start talking differently for certain words and certain expressions at all these different possible levels of linguistics, from phonetics to discourse even. So there. Okay, so just a quick overview and some examples of the kinds of changes that have happened over the centuries. In Old English, the k in front of the n sound was actually pronounced, in case anyone has ever wondered why we write knit with a k in front of it and knife with a k in front of it. And the reason is because in Old English these words were pronounced as knit and knive. So that is a pronunciation-related change. And interestingly, we still keep writing the k there, and that is an indication of a force in language, that when a language has become standardized, then people are kind of really reluctant to change the spelling system. In Middle English, it was still the k was still pronounced. So we just continue happily to write it and rarely question it, even though when you were in elementary schools and had to be taught to write that k there in front of an n, it's like it can't be sounded because it's not sounded anymore. It used to be. So that's a phonetic level, pronunciation level change, but there is also semantic change, and if this were the history of the English class, we would be talking much more extensively about this. But here's just a quick example. The word nice, nowadays the adjective, it has gone through semantic evolution in a way. Nice used to mean ignorant, and then it started to mean fastidious, and then it started to mean precise, and now you can use nice just about for anything. There's been semantic bleaching there. It's a very weak meaning semantically adjective, and if you say, oh, that's nice, it doesn't really mean that it's anything really special, but it certainly doesn't mean ignorant like it used to be. So there's been what we call amelioration. The meaning has become nicer and nicer, and also if you may have heard this adjective in the combination, adjective-noun combination, that's a nice distinction, meaning a very precise distinction. So the older meaning, that particular meaning, still kind of sort of lingers, but I don't know, would you ever use something like nice distinction, meaning precise distinction? Probably not. It's starting to totally become obsolete. So we talked last time about language varying over time in physical space and socially. And this is interesting because it's just not in physical space that language varies. What do we typically call the historical variation of language over time? What's the synonym for historical variation? Diachronic variation, yes. So language variation over time is referred to as diachronic variation. In physical space, can probably use the regional dialect studies as the example of that. So language change is variation over time, and then we, of course, we talked last time, why does language change and how does it change? So the source of change is in current variation. So regional and spatial and social variation provide these different kinds of variations. They provide the basis for change over time. So somebody's way of saying something will take over. And this leads to interesting linguistic consequences sometimes, like which became to be pronounced as homophones. Not everybody pronounced these two words in exactly the same way. Do you know anyone who would make a distinction between these two in pronunciation?
Dr. Adams.
Yeah, indeed, Dr. Adams, yes. So he would say which, and when, and why. Same thing with whether and whether, and whether. But most people today do not make this distinction anymore. The pronunciation of new as new and nuclear as nuclear, or even nuclear with a metathesis there in the middle of the word. Those are examples of variations over time. And with the whether and whether distinction, we can see that, we can identify a person who uses the I would say older, don't tell Dr. Adams, pronunciation, and there we can kind of realize that, hey, this is how language changes. Some people hang on to a particular pronunciation, and then some people don't, and then we can kind of see what is going to win in 50 years or so. But many of us have individual variation in how we say things like, what do you say this word? How do you say this word? Two possibilities. How do you say that? This. Either, neither, or either, neither. So we can use both. And do you kind of like stick to one pronunciation always? No, it varies in an individual speaker's language, and then that can last for a long time. That there are two ways of saying this, but then pronunciation will change. Language will change because of this variation. If one of the pronunciation takes over, if nobody says neither and either anymore, it may be attached with some, I don't know, is it more formal? Is it more, does it signal anything? Is it indexical of any social issues? Or are these totally neutral? Either, neither, either, neither.
They're neutral.
Yeah. When are you likelier to say either and neither?
Whenever it sounds better.
Whenever it sounds, exactly. So that's an interesting potential study. For instance, if you have people read a paragraph which has both of these words and don't tell them that it has both of these words there, and you're interested in the pronunciation of whether it comes out as either or neither, or either or neither, then if you interview and record enough people, then you can kind of start making certain generalizations of who the people might be who always say neither. But nobody probably always, I don't know. That's something that is very worthwhile to study. So what do you think is going to be more likely to take over if one of these pronunciations is going to become obsolete? Either or either.
I think it depends on the region, though. I feel like
Region, it could be regional, yeah.
Here in the South, we would most likely say either or neither, speaking.
Yes.
And because I feel like when I read, sometimes I pronounce it as either
Yeah.
and neither.
So it's situation dependent. So then it would be really interesting to try to figure out what is the situation where I'm more likely to say either or neither. Either and neither as opposed to either and neither. So this is a linguistic variable, and the pronunciations with an E versus I would be the variance of that linguistic variable. Okay, so here is a lexical example at the very bottom of the page. How do people say really good if they want to say that something is really good? So we mentioned this earlier, that it's easy to somehow date yourself to a particular decade when you use a particular word for something a little bit slangy, not so formal. So super and spiffing and bonzer and groovy would put you to which decades? 70s, right? Groovy was, I remember, the first time I came to the United States, it was in 1972, and groovy was definitely a word that was used. You hear it in songs and so on. Then we got cool, and of course cool was, and these are all quite informal adjectives. Cool became the word to use, and you can see, why would cool, because cool originally refers to the temperature, why would it become to mean something really good? And that has stuck. It's interesting. Groovy didn't stick, and bonzer and spiffing, these died, and yet cool has been holding on. Neat is still used, so that's neat. Do you think it's getting to be old-fashioned? Neat.
Which one are you asking?
Would you still use neat in your language?
Yeah.
What
I
about
feel
you?
like it's usually like sarcastic. It's like, oh, that's neat.
Oh.
It's not really like a good thing anymore.
So is it starting to pick up some semantic change, maybe?
I feel like it's a word I would use like talking to children. I'm like, oh, that's neat.
Okay, so it's baby talk.
Yeah, that's how I see it.
Yes. What about, how do you feel about neat? Do you see any change there?
I think I don't use it as much anymore, but
Yeah.
I think it just depends on the situation. Because I would rather over me, I would use cool.
Yeah. Yes. So, I mean, we never know what will happen, but this is also something that, would be a worthwhile little project that you would say to people, how do you say if something is really, really good? Like, you see something nice happen, so how would you refer, what word would you use for it? So, like, maybe give a frame or give some kind of like prompt that somebody gives you an unexpected present, and what would you say to the person? Oh, that was really cool. How would you describe it? That was really cool. That was really neat. That was really. Would anyone say that was really groovy? Probably not. So fantastic is something that has been, I think, added relatively late to the language. Do you ever use that to describe that something's really, really great?
Not as much as I used to as a kid. It looks like a big word, and you're like, okay, I can hear that.
Yeah, it's, you know, when something fantastic is a very strong word, but if it's started to be used too often, then it's no longer really fantastic. It becomes kind of semantically bleached and more neutral, like neat and cool. So, yeah.
Sarcastic. The word fantastic
Yeah.
is used sarcastically.
Sarcastically?
Yeah, it's kind of like the neat thing too. And it's like
Oh,
when something
okay,
really bad happens, you're
fantastic.
like, well, that's fantastic.
Oh, yes, okay. Yes, well, that's interesting. How sarcasm can bring semantic change when something is used sarcastic. Like really, seriously. So that's those kinds of things. Or fantastic. So, you know, someone breaks into your house and you come home and you say, fantastic. So that's definitely like sarcastic. All right. Could be even something less dramatic. Magic, excellent. Excellent? Is that starting to be kind of like neutralized in its meaning?
Yeah, I only hear it in the school setting. Like when the teacher's like, oh,
Excellent.
And like the little stickers that they give you.
So it's kind of like defined by the setting. Yeah, well that's interesting. Wicked, does anyone use that anymore?
A lot up north.
Really?
Yeah. It's like a Boston thing. It's like, oh, that's wicked cool, or that's wicked hot.
Oh,
It
okay,
doesn't
so
mean
you
like-
can double up with.
Yeah, it doesn't really mean like good. It means like exceptionally. Like you add it to an adjective.
Oh, interesting. Well, clearly there is change because I hadn't heard that combination before.
Yeah.
That's cool. The same thing, bad, meaning its opposite. Is that still in use?
I feel like I've probably heard. I don't know. I've heard mad.
Oh,
Yeah, I hear a lot of mad now. Like that's mad good.
mad,
Mad cool.
mad cool. Okay. That's interesting. Hot. Well, rad. We mentioned rad before. It was brought by Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in the 1980s, and that was before your time. But my children were small when everything was rad, and that comes from their super cool adjective, radical. So anyway, that didn't stick because if somebody says rad, you know, it's definitely someone who grew up in the 1980s. Tight and the bomb, is that out already? The bomb. Yeah, I haven't heard it. But anyway, so here's another idea for a possible project. Ask people, how do you describe something that is really good? Yes.
Have you heard people use sick as doing really good?
Yes. Yeah. That's good. It's a relatively recent addition, isn't it? Yes. Yeah. Sick. Right. And it's interesting when you know, we take, there seems to be this pattern that we take something that is supposed to be like bad, like sick and bad and wicked, and then it takes its opposite meaning. So that's you know what we do with with slang sometimes. And the slang terms, it's kind of like a toss-up. Okay, somebody introduces a really, really good, whatever adjectives you want to use there, slang term for really good. And whether it's going to last the test of decades, we don't know.
It's kind of like how we use lit to, oh, that's lit. Like some people use it as like, oh, that's cool, even though it has like a whole different definition as well.
Yes.
Because lit technically means like people are gonna smoke or like be a certain way.
Yeah.
But I hear a lot of like, you know, I guess younger boys would say. Well, I guess like younger people will say, oh, that's lit. And I'm like, oh, I guess we're using that now to be cool.
Yes, yes. But you can see how you could take this kind of a topic and go and do your project on that. See how it varies and what the principles of variation might be. So why do particular changes spread, and how do linguistics changes spread through the community? We talked about this a little bit, and very often in sociolinguistic texts, the post-vocalic R is used as an example, and that's here it surfaces again in our little summary of language change and variation. So what is interesting about the post-vocalic R, like in start and star after the vowel R, is that you can pronounce it or you don't have to. Start and star would be good pronunciations, native speaker pronunciations. Whether they index a region or something else, some other demographic feature, is interesting to study, and sociolinguists have studied this, like most famously William Labov in the department store studies, which we have talked about quite a bit. So, what what this is a good example about, and I haven't really emphasized this earlier, but I will now. That that linguistic variation, a different way of saying, for instance, something, when we have phonetic variation, it doesn't have any value in itself. Like this doesn't have any value. It's not a good thing or a bad thing. So for instance, leaving the R out in England is what is part of the BBC English, received pronunciation, Queen's English, educated language. So people would say start and star in Britain, and it has prestige. That pronunciation has prestige there. Whereas if you leave the R out in the United States, it does not have prestige, right? So it's an indication, like in New York, it's an indication of a working class background, lower socioeconomic class. And sometimes it's an indication of, like, for instance, in African American vernacular, the is often left out. So these in America are classified as non-standard varieties. Whereas in Britain, if you pronounce the R, it's associated with working class background there, a non-prestigious pronunciation. So isn't that interesting that R in itself is totally neutral and without any attachments to prestige or not? It's a sound in English, but if you leave it out or if you have it in the same linguistic environment, like at the end of the word star or star, it signals different things, it indexes different things in Britain than in the United States. So this is what is important to keep in mind. There's nothing prestigious per se in a particular pronunciation, in a particular sound, but we attach those prestige or non-prestige to particular pronunciations, and that's based on who the people are who are using a particular pronunciation. So in Britain, the post-vocalic R deletion happens to be done by the upper classes, starting from the Queen, and that's why it's considered a prestigious pronunciation. It has overt prestige, but we've talked extensively about covert prestige, and it's so in some rural southern parts of England, and definitely you have in Scotland, Ireland, you get the R pronounced. Okay, so this is an example of the arbitrariness of the forms that happen to be standard in any community. The first three words here, start and star and start and soaring, are an example of the fact that the R is not deleted ever in a word like soaring, even though there is variation in star and start. And the last words here, law and order, folklore and mythology, we sometimes have the intrusive R added, which is kind of like hyper-correction in a way. People think, okay, I'm deleting R's, and that's non-standard, so I have to be careful and add the R's where it's not supposed to be according to the standard language. So lore and order. It's very easy to put that rolling R there. Lore and order. Folklore and mythology. There the R would be, it's likelier to be pronounced, but sometimes you get it in lore and order. Have you heard of the pronunciation washer with an R there after the A, like washer? It's probably more in the Midwest, but this is what is called an intrusive R, that we find an R where it's not quote unquote supposed to be, but of course, if native speakers say it, pronounce it, then it's a native speaker dialect. So just to kind of like wrap up how these changes spread, they spread from group to group, and that happens, of course, over time. So here we have these green little circles at time 1. Certain pronunciation is used by group A, and then from group A, like waves, if you throw a pebble into a pond, the waves kind of go like, get a bigger circle. And so it spreads the change, spreads that pronunciation, changes from spreads from group A to group B, and at time 3, a little bit later on, it reaches the third circle, group C, and time 4, it may reach group 4 already. So it is like, there's the change, and it spreads outward to other groups of speakers. So this is based on a sociolinguist, Bailey. In the 70s, he wrote these studies, made this insightful proposal that this is how change can spread. So A, B, C, and D are different age groups or social groups or regional groups. So whatever groups they are, but it goes from one group to another. From group to group, and then from style to style, interestingly. So we would like, for instance, if we again use the post-vocalic R pronunciation in New York, So the social groups would be there on the horizontal line, social groups 1, 2, and 3, and two different styles. The first, the formal style and the casual style. And this particular, these X's indicate that the change has spread from formal, the pronunciation of R in a formal situation of upper class to formal situations in the middle class group, and eventually to formal situations in group number 3, that social group, and eventually from formal it can spread to casual pronunciations as well. Well, it hasn't really happened completely, because you go to New York and you still hear people not using the R there, or in New England, for instance, if you listen to Bernie Sanders, he doesn't pronounce the post-vocalic R's. It's quite distinctive, and he certainly doesn't come from working class, so it's a regional feature still there. Kind of like, hasn't changed, and it hasn't changed because, we address this issue. Why doesn't this change kind of like happen, like wipe all over everywhere? And it doesn't, because there is the contradictory force of covert prestige, that there are certain pronunciations that mark, that solid lower and working class association that people want to appeal to, politicians especially. Okay, so that's the second kind. From group to group, from style to style, and then the third way, from word to word, and this is referred to as lexical diffusion. You have this in chapter 8 explained, and it's referred to as the S-shaped curve, that here at the bottom we would have units of time, time 1, then a little bit later time 2, time 3, time 4, and so on. And the change has a pronunciation in certain words. We would have like 20% time that word pronounced with a particular pronunciation, and then it goes up to 60%, 80%, until then it may slow down. You still have words where you don't pronounce this, you don't use that particular pronunciation, and then eventually, if the change goes through, all the words will have that pronunciation. And I mentioned last time, words like whose and moose, Old English words where the U was pronounced as U, and then it became pronounced as ow. So today we say house and mouse. All long U's became ow. But of course it doesn't happen overnight. It has to go through this lexical diffusion, this S-shaped curve, that first you have a few words that are pronounced as mouse and house, and then that starts spreading to other words, and now all the words that used to be oo, used to have oo in earlier forms of English, they now have ow. So that was part of the great vowel shift that took a couple of centuries to complete. So none of this change happens instantaneously. It has to spread from group to group, from style to style, and from time to time, obviously. Okay, let's start talking about stuff in chapter 9. This is a super short chapter, and we're doing it in 2 parts still. So this introduces us to ethnographic approaches to sociolinguistics. In sociolinguistics, there's an S missing from the end, sorry about that. So ethnography, it studies the rules and the cultural norms and the values that are somehow intertwined with language use. Because language reflects everything. We have talked a lot about identity, what we want to signal about ourselves by the way we talk, in the same way as we choose a certain style of clothing to signal things about ourselves. We choose a certain kind of language to signal who we are, what our affiliations are, what our group identities are, and so on. And it's really a powerful thing of doing that, you know. So we haven't really talked much about the cultural norms and societal rules and values that language use may also reflect. So it does reflect these individual identities, but it also reflects the kinds of culture that we are embedded in which we live, and certain norms and certain values that we agree with, and certain values and rules and norms that we disagree with. So in a very divided world or country that we have now, it's you know, there are always divisions and political differences and so on, but recently they have been really exaggerated, and you know, like for instance, you turn on the radio on your car to a news channel, for instance, it does not take long to figure out what the political affiliations of people who are talking are, right? Have you noticed that we can, you know, it's this comes from this side and this comes from this side. So so we can very quickly kind of like put people in these categories, either left or right. And that is because in language, the cultural rules and norms and values, that's how we express our values and norms and rules, what we believe in. This may be an exaggerated situation, and of course it doesn't, you know, people pronounce things the same way, whether they come from the left or from the right, but there are interesting ways of, because we notice that it's not necessarily the content only, but you know, what kinds of words you use to refer to certain kinds of events, for instance. And I'm not going to go into that, but it is an interesting topic. Again, you know, if you want to study how you can tell what the values of a person are from the way they speak, like for instance, choices of words. So there's another idea. Okay. Now, in ethnographic studies, and I do want to emphasize that politics is not the only thing, but you know, different cultural issues, cultural norms specifically, and cultural values, because those vary, and we do express those in language. So method that is used in these ethnographic approaches in sociolinguistics, the very common method is participant observation. And your book kind of underscores that you really can't say that you know a particular culture unless you have really lived there and been as a member of that culture. Of course, this leads to the problem which we refer to as, you know, the observer's paradox, that you go and live in a particular community and your presence there may change, especially if you say, oh, I'm writing a dissertation about your culture, and then people may be very careful about what they say and what they do and so on. I worked a long time ago with the Alabama Cachada Reservation here in Livingston, Texas, and I did a sociolinguistic study there about how they are maintaining the languages, but I got to know a researcher, a girl from UT, who was writing her dissertation. She actually moved to live there, and that way she was embedded for a long time, for about I forget how long she lived there, but long enough in order to become a member. Not to become a member of the tribe, obviously, but to be accepted as one of the community member. So, and that's how she was able to do her anthropological study. Okay, so the approach in ethnography is typically qualitative. We have looked at a lot of quantitative studies, the numbers and percentages and correlations and so on. Who says what and how many times people use are and how many times certain people use the in as opposed to ing and so on. These would be quantitative studies, but qualitative studies are overwhelmingly more prevalent in ethnographic approaches, that you describe what is going on, not in terms of numbers and correlations and percentages, but with certain generalizations, and those are valid studies as well if you do them well. Ethnography of communication is the first, actually the chapter 9 is divided into three different kinds of ethnographic approaches. Ethnography of communication is one, then ethnomethodology and linguistic ethnography. That's the remainder of this chapter, and we'll talk a little bit about those next time. So what is again emphasized in ethnographic studies is this communicative competence, notion of communicative competence. That is a notion that was introduced by sociolinguist Del Hymes in the 1970s, and this was like in direct response to Noam Chomsky's term, linguistic competence. So linguistic competence is not a prevalent term in ethnographic studies, but communicative competence is. Now, what is the difference? We kind of went over this briefly earlier, but it's important in ethnographic studies. So linguistic competence is that you know how to pronounce the sounds of a particular language, you know the sound system, you know how to inflect words and derive words, so you know the morphology, you know in which order in phrases and sentences you need to put words, and you know the meanings of words, you know semantics. So these 5 areas of language, phonology, phonetics, phonology, morphology, syntax, and semantics. You are competent in those areas, and that's your linguistic competence. And we have to have linguistic competence in order to communicate. But on top of that, what Del Hymes wanted to say, we also need communicative competence. Noam Chomsky's idea of a competent, linguistically competent speaker was this idealized speaker here who is an abstraction in a way, because we all have these performance level issues in our language usage, that we hesitate and we have false starts and we go like or like or when we look for words. So these are performance level things. Noam Chomsky was not really interested in that, and he was not interested in communication in real language use situations. His examples, and he is brilliant. He's still brilliant. He revolutionized the field of linguistics, and that needed to be done. And what he claimed by this notion of linguistic competence was really good, really kind of like equalizing thing, that he underscored that every native speaker is competent in his or her first language, first dialect. And that's great. So no matter who you are, even regardless of a person's IQ, everybody is competent in their language, and that needed to be made. That point needed to be made. But then Del Himes was like, we all know people who know how to pronounce words, know what the possible sound combinations in a language are, know how to form words, know how to organize the words in a sentence grammatically, and know the meanings of words. So people may have linguistic competence, but they may not know how to use that language in a situation, in a language use situation, in a context of language use, and we then tend to think that there's something odd about this person if they are not adhering to the rules and norms of language use situations. And of course, you learn these rules and these norms when you grow up using the language on a daily basis. So we kind of, there is a term for that, and that's language socialization of children. So perhaps more so than linguistic competence, the children are not taught to be linguistically competent. They grow up, and because of the innateness of language, children acquire that language without their parents teaching that. No, English is a subject, verb, object language, so that's the order you have to use when you build sentences from English words. But parents, quite often, they teach communicative competence, not just by exposing the child to it, but sometimes explicitly. Like a child gets a gift, and what does the mother say? The child starts opening the wrappings, and the mother says, "Now, what do you say?" Say thank you. And that is communicative competence. There's nothing that doesn't have anything to do with linguistic competence. But a 3-year-old needs to be taught that when you get something, you say thank you. So what do you say? We coax, we kind of like guide the children to do that. What other things do we have to teach children? What?
Please.
Yes, what's the magic word? So please, say please. That is culture specific, like sir and ma'am is something that you kind of like have to remind. So what word is missing? You didn't say yes sir, you didn't say no ma'am, And you come from a different place. We're in Texas here, so we use sir and ma'am, and we go to another place, and sir and ma'am are not used.
It was confusing when I first moved down here.
Yes.
I remember I was in like 5th grade or something when I moved, and one of the teachers asked me a question, and I just repeated like, yeah, that's fine. And she was like, what? You can't say that to me. And I was like, answer your question. I don't understand. She's like, you're supposed to say yes, ma'am. And I was like,
And what did you think about that?
huh?
What did you think about that?
Oh, it was so weird.
And you came from Northeast, right? Yes. Yes, it is weird, and then yet you grew up here, and you did too. So did you, like, explicitly were you told to say ma'am and sir?
At home, my dad never really said to say yes ma'am or like yes sir.
Yes.
As long as we don't like raise our tone, like yes daddy or yes mommy, like
Yeah.
stay that way. But I think when I got to elementary school is where I was exposed to, I guess, my friends, my classmates.
Mm-hmm.
They were taught to say yes ma'am and yes sir, and their parents were like, how do you say, like what do you say, like yes sir?
Yes.
And then the teachers would kind of like accept that kind of answer. So it kind of just got to me, and as an adult working, I have to use yes ma'am or yes sir, because people will get offended if you don't use it.
Yes. But again, that ma'am and sir, they may have different meanings. The usage may have different meanings in a different place. We'll talk about sarcasm, for instance. Like, yes, ma'am. My daughter had a similar experience when we moved here from California, and she went to junior high. And in a math class, she was doing something, and the teacher came by, and she said yes. And the teacher is like, there's a word missing. And she was totally clueless. She was like, what word is missing? And you have to say, yes, sir. And, growing up in California, going to school in California, you didn't use that. I was once telling this to my class, and I had a student who said she had the opposite experience, that she grew up in Texas, and her family moved to California. And she, in school, she said to her teacher, yes, ma'am. And the teacher had actually sent her to the principal's office because she had been a smart aleck for saying yes, ma'am. And she was being, poor thing, was just being, a Texas grown girl, was trying to be polite the way she knew to be polite. And so, we come and we'll have a chapter on intercultural communication. This is part of intercultural communication, because you grow up in a particular part of the country and you are linguistically socialized to different kinds of behaviors. That has nothing to do with linguistic competence, it has to do with communicative competence. And communicative competence we pick up from the culture we grow up in. Like saying please. In some languages, you don't say please as much as you say here. And that tends to have kind of like a carryover into another language. In my first language, we don't use please. I mean, there is please, the word or the phrase please, like it's literally be good, ole hyvä. But if I ask a person to do something, I wouldn't necessarily use it, and it would not be impolite. There are other ways of being, intonations, or different forms that index that you are asking nicely. You're being polite, but we don't use the phrase please nearly as much as in this country. And then that may come out as because in my culture I didn't use it, in this culture it should be used more, and then I may come out as rude or what have you. And this is the interesting thing, and we'll talk more about this when we talk about intercultural communication, that we perceive people as rude if they don't adhere to our rules of communicative competence. There's a huge difference in, like, for instance, in how silence is tolerated in different countries and different cultures, and we'll talk more about that. But the interesting thing is that within English speakers, there are differences in the norms of communicative competence. Here's another thing to maybe think about for a paper, and you could then just do like a literature overview and add some observations of your own language. Any comments on this?
I kind of wish we didn't do the yes ma'am and yes sir thing here in Texas, because I worked in drive-thru at like fast food restaurants, and some men do not sound like with any bass in their voice, and some women have really low voices. So if I say yes ma'am or yes sir to the wrong person, it gets offensive. And I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry, sir, or like, ma'am, like I see them at the window. And it's just so hard to determine who's a man or who's a woman through the drive-thru. And it kind of made me think, like, why do we have to put yes ma'am or yes sir at the end of the sentence or when we ask something? Because there are people who are, who don't identify with either female or male pronouns. And I also don't want to offend them either. So it's always been a struggle for me, like, should I or should I say that? Because I don't want to offend anyone either way, but I was taught to use this to be polite.
Yes, and that is so interesting. That's really interesting. I remember when moving here, and all my students are always like, yes ma'am, and I think it may have been a little bit more prevalent 25 years ago when I moved to Huntsville. There may have been change that people don't, because there's more exchange, coming and going, and more, I would say, more people who don't necessarily speak English as their first language. And like for me, I had to learn it here, and I still don't use it quite a bit. I tend to use yes sir, sarcastically to my husband. But this ma'am, when students said to me when I moved here, they were like, yes ma'am, no ma'am. I'm like, this makes me feel old. And but of course you are older, but than the students who say it to you, but it was a cultural thing, and it was just a politeness marker for my students, so I got over it.
I actually use yes sir with my boyfriend, and it makes him, he's like, stop, not that old, like, oh, he used that with me. I'm like, okay, yes sir. And then he still gets offended, like, just for fun.
That's interesting. You could do a nice quick study of those interactions. But communicative competence, that's an interesting term, and we'll come back to this when we talk about intercultural communication. Okay, here's the speaking acronym, the summary, which Delheims also came up with. And we have already, remember I gave you that handout where we had the different components of the speech situation, like participants and goals and setting and so on. And the individual characteristics of the speaker and identities, and speaker as an individual or a speaker as a member of a community and so on. Well, this is kind of like not really repeating it, but phrasing it a little bit differently. And Himes came up with this speaking model, where speaking is an acronym which kind of puts together everything that he wanted to be included in communicative competence. So we change, and this has to do with variation, because based on these changes in the context, we change the way we speak in subtle ways, sometimes not so subtle ways. So S stands for setting and scene. That's very clear, where we are, the physical setting, what the scene is, and that is exactly what we have been, how we have been describing that particular constraint of the different ways of speaking. Participants, obviously, who is speaking, who is being spoken to, who the interlocutors are, bystanders, and so on. Ends is the same as goals. A is, here it gets maybe a little bit more blurry, but this is still a really great acronym to keep in mind to kind of like to underscore the fact that there are multiple things that affect how we affect what we need to take into consideration in order to be communicatively competent, use the right kinds of words. So act sequence, this refers to words used, how the words are used, and the relationship of language to the topic. So that's the A in speaking. Then K refers to key. Key stands for key. Key refers to tone, manner, and spirit of talking. Tone, manner, and spirit, these are affected by how we feel in a particular kind of a situation, and that's kind of keyed into the way we speak. Tone, is it enthusiastic? Is it like bored, or what have you? Then instrumentalities, the I, it refers to the choice of channel. Is it writing? It could also be referred to as mode. Writing or oral or sign language, choice of a code, and so on. So these are instrumentalities. N stands for norms of interaction and norms of interpretation. And that's cultural norms and so on. And the G at the end is referring to genre, what kind of a genre we are engaged in. That leads to a particular kind of a variety. So we know, and we know whether this is a poem, whether it's a piece of fiction, whether it's a sermon, whether it's a proverb, whether it's a lecture, and so on. So if I start something like, once upon a time, we had this example before, once upon a time, it's going to be a fairy tale. And if something ends, and they lived happily ever after, it's the end of a fairy tale. So we get that we identify, using linguistic cues, we identify what the genres are. Editorial in a newspaper, is it an opinion piece? Is it a reporting article? Is it a political cartoon? Whatever. So those would be genres. And this is something that I would like you to work on at home. Use this speaking acronym to define what gossip is. This is exploration number 9.2. So define, what is the scene or setting? Who are the participants? And so on, and so forth. So go through all these letters in speaking and try to define, kind of like flesh out if the speech event is gossip, what's the setting? What are the participants, and so on and so forth. So be prepared to have that done by next time. You know, it's just jot down something, and it helps you to kind of understand this this acronym that Hymes invented in a concrete manner. Okay, and I think that's it for today. Bye.